Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with Amar Peterman, author of a new book titled Becoming Neighbors, The Common Good Made Local from Erdman's. Amar is an Indian American author and scholar working at the intersection of faith and public life. Was adopted from northern India and raised in the cornfields of northeast Wisconsin. He moved to downtown Chicago to attend Moody Bible Institute, where he earned a degree in theology. There he served as president of the Student Theological Society and teaching assistant to Dr. Ashish Sharma. After Moody, Amar moved to the East Coast, where he earned an MDiv from Princeton Theological Seminary. Amar's program concentrated on public theology and American religious history under renowned historian Heath W. Carter. Amar is currently a PhD student at the University of Chicago Divinity School. Amar is the founder of Scholarship for Religion and Society, LLC, a research and consulting firm working with some of the leading philanthropic and civic institutions, religious organizations, and faith leaders in America today. He's also the civic strategy specialist at Interfaith America. You can learn more at amarpeterman.com. That's AMARPETERMAN.com. So Amar, thanks so much for joining us, and many congratulations on all of your work.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's great to be with you on today of all days when the book is finally out in the world.
Is this actually the book launch as we're
This is
recording
the book
today?
launch day. Yeah.
Oh, good. I try to, schedule these around that time, but I never usually hit it exactly on the day. So that's wonderful. Congratulations. Happy book birthday.
Thank you. Thank you.
So what else would you like folks to know about you?
I mean, you're that mouthful of an introduction, which I have put up on the website and places like that, covers a lot of it. Um, but yeah, I mean, you hear from the introduction that I have been formed and shaped in a lot of different places. And I hope that in my scholarship, that's reflected, that I do in all of my work my best not to put up caricatures of
Hmm.
people I disagree with. And people I do agree with, but instead to try to engage with the lived reality and lived theology of people on the ground, which is messy and complicated work. But I think that's the work that we're called to do, and it's the work that's needed for today. And so, yeah, that grounds a lot of what I do, and hopefully that comes through in the book and in this conversation.
Cool, cool. So before we get into the book, I'd really love for you to tell folks more about your work at Interfaith America. That's, to me, an impressive organization that's done a lot.
Yeah, I've been at Interfaith America since uh, what would that be? Fall of 2022. That's a long time. I've been there for a minute.
Mhm.
After graduating from seminary, was at a different job and ended up resigning from it. And my wife and I had bought this house in Milwaukee that we're at now. Uh, and we both were jobless and figuring out what to do next, but we knew where we were going. And so I started a business. I started a consulting and research firm and tried to use the connections and networks I had made in seminary to build a client base. And Interfaith America was one of the first folks to come on and say, absolutely, let's work together. And so over that summer of 2022, we collaborated on a project that coincidentally is now the project that I'm running at Interfaith America. But it was at the time focused, it was called Evangelicals in a Diverse Democracy, and was engaging and bringing together kind of these high-level thought leaders in the American evangelical tradition to imagine what the future of the tradition might hold from various perspectives. And so there were a lot of incredible folks from very different theological traditions and social locations who all place themselves around the evangelical ecosystem.
Hmm.
And that grew into a project now called the Good Neighbors Project that is developing public resources for specifically for evangelicals, but from an interfaith and pluralistic lens to ask, what does it mean for evangelicals to love their neighbors of other faith traditions in a way that doesn't compromise or betray their values as evangelicals, their beliefs and their doctrines, uh, and their commitment to the Christian faith. And I think my argument there is that I don't think evangelicals have to betray anything to love their neighbors of different faith traditions. That, in fact, working alongside them, being in relationship with them, is a living out of the best parts of the Christian tradition and the evangelical tradition. I think it's what we see in the example of Christ's ministry. I think it's what God calls us to. I think it's where this Holy Spirit is working to shape our communities deeply. And I think we see examples of that throughout the Christian scriptures of what it would mean to join together across lines of difference. So I wholeheartedly bring my own faith into this work, and I encourage others to do the same. And so, yeah, I've been there for a handful of years now as a program manager and then an assistant director. And now while I'm in my PhD program at U Chicago, I'm there half-time as a civic strategy specialist, which is as ambiguous of a title as the other two. But the work is important and it's meaningful, and I'm really glad to be there.
Cool, cool. That's got to be an exciting place to work.
Yeah, absolutely. Growing quickly. Uh,
Good.
yeah, which has been fun to be a part of in the past handful of years.
Cool, cool. Well, let's talk about your book. As I mentioned, the title is Becoming Neighbors, the Common Good Made Local. So who doesn't like that, right? I mean, it's a great title. So how did the book come about?
Yeah, I mean, it really is. The idea of it came through my own experience of unbelonging. I grew up in Northeast Wisconsin. I'm adopted from India. I was raised in a Polish Catholic neighborhood where when I went to public school, I was with a whole bunch of Polish Catholics who were going through confirmation, practicing Lent, which we're in now. Uh, and but I wasn't Catholic. I grew up down the road or in the town over at a big, predominantly white evangelical megachurch, adorned with the flashing lights and the super expensive soundboard and fog machines on Easter and Christmas and all of those things. And so I was raised between these two spaces that were both, in my context, deeply white spaces, um, and who didn't have many answers for me when it came to trying to understand the world around me, my place within it, trying to make sense of why me and my parents or family or friends shared the same objective experience. We'd go to the same place, we'd watch the same movie, uh, and yet our experiences were still vastly different
Hmm.
because of the way that I engaged those spaces or was engaged in those spaces. Um, and so those questions of place and belonging that were left unresolved uh, took me ironically to Moody Bible Institute, which is another white,
Yeah.
I think, unashamedly white evangelical institution in downtown Chicago. I say I went there out of ignorance in the sense that I didn't know any better. I felt a call to ministry through my time in this evangelical church growing up. Um, and none of my family went through any sort of theological education. And so I was Googling Bible college to see what came up. And of course, there was Wheaton and Biola and these other,
Sure.
very large schools that are, I'm sure, great in their own ways. I also couldn't even begin to afford going to those schools.
Hmm.
And then Moody comes along, which some pastors at my church had gone to, very few ended
Hmm.
up graduating from, but all
Hmm.
had spent time there.
Hmm.
Uh, and it was a tuition paid program in downtown Chicago and seemed, for me growing up in a small town, like the place to be.
I mean,
And
downtown,
so,
I used to work in downtown Chicago too when I was
mm,
in college. And so I understand the attraction there. It's great.
yeah. And so being at Moody, I was in the bubble of sorts that Moody wanted to provide, but then I also expanded out and went to UIC's Muslim Student Association because there
Hmm.
was a bunch of South Asian students there,
Hmm.
and that was a place to engage with other South Asians in the city, uh, and going out and meeting people and exploring. We had the student Ventura Pass, and so all the CTA was free, and so Chicago just became this world to explore. And I tried my best to take advantage of that. And
Yeah.
in that process, I had to reconcile with this odd experience of going and hanging out with a bunch of South Asians who are Muslim, who I seem to have more in common with than the white Christians who I shared a dorm room with, or a dorm floor with. And what I didn't know what to make of that. Uh, and so that was a process, and I met a South Asian theologian at Moody who's no longer there, but that's who the book is dedicated to
Mm,
Ashish,
mm.
who mentored me and guided me through my time at Moody, through, the closed door of his office where he showed me liberation theologians, uh, and the folks who were never allowed to be on a syllabus for a systematic theology class or an apologetics class. And that deeply formed me to
Mm.
see a lot of who's cited in the book, folks who are deeply rooted in their Christian faith and yet expanded their vision of who is worthy of love and care, and flourishing beyond the people who agreed with them. And so these are all things that got me to the point of wanting to write the book. It came about through a conversation with a professor who uh, I talked to. It was Heath who I studied with and who was so generous in providing connections and networks and names, and emails, which is another step beyond saying you should talk to this person. He'd say, "Here's their email. Reach out to them and
Yeah,
say I
yeah.
sent you." Um, and one of those people was Lisa at Erdman's.
Ah,
Um, and he was abundantly generous in telling Lisa, like, this is someone you should talk to. Uh, Lisa and I went back and forth for a bit on different book proposals, and being in seminary and then recently out of seminary, I was writing like a seminarian, which isn't wrong or bad. A lot of my articles early on were like that. But Lisa's encouragement was to say, what do you want to say for the church? What do you want to say to pastors? What do you want to say to lay leaders? And then how can you say it in a way that they actually want to read it, and not read some essay that you're submitting for, the end of a term paper for a class, but is
right,
compelling and
right.
moving, and applicable to their lives. And through that process, we came to this book of, it was initially titled This Common Life,
Mm,
which was a play on Norman Wiersbe's book, This
mm,
Sacred Life, that
mm.
was deeply meaningful to me, and post-seminary shaped a lot of how I was imagining the world around us, uh, and became the name of my Substack. And
Mm.
so we're playing with that. And then when it came to pick a title, I was consistently thinking about, the name of the book comes from Eugene Peterson's translation of the Good Parable Samaritan, where he translates Jesus' question to the scholar of the law, as who became a neighbor to the one who was in need. And I think it encapsulates this expansive vision of the neighbor,
Mm.
that it's not just a um, kind of locative or geographic reality of the person who lives across the street from me is my neighbor. That's true, but also the work of neighborliness is active. It's not a set or static disposition. It is a reality we inhabit. The people around me are my neighbors. And also, the task for the Christian is to become neighbors to the people around us. And so that's the heart of the book. I'm so glad that Erdman's was amicable and cheered on that title. But the book came about through the people that I'd met along the way, my own experience of unbelonging and paradoxical belonging, and really this question that's arisen for me in the past handful of years of how do we live together, in a world that's so deeply divided, and assumes that these divisions must necessitate that we can't work together and that we have to be antagonistic, if not hateful, towards one another. I think we're called to something so much better than that, which is the flourishing of everyone in our communities. And so that's the heart of the book. And yeah, I'm so glad Erdman's and Lisa felt that shared vision and wanted to champion this book.
Cool, cool. Well, like I said before, it's a great title. I think that will do well for it. And isn't the power of networking and relationship building just amazing?
It is.
You
It
know, like
is.
you said, the fact that, Heath was so generous with his network really helped you out. I mean, I've had the same, experience myself with, all kinds of different folks that did introductions for me. And I try to model that every day that I can to help other people get connected, in some place that's beneficial to both parties.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Same here.
So, since you spent some time in New Jersey, where I live, I have to ask you about something you say in your acknowledgement section. Um, you say this: a few miles up Highway 27 from Princeton, Jacob's Well in North Brunswick modeled this vision of the common good cultivated at a shared table that remained at the front of my mind as I wrote this book. So, can you tell us a little bit about Jacob's Well? I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this. Jacob's Well is such a dear place in my heart. Um, it is not where I expected to be in seminary. Uh, when I was at Moody, my wife and I ended up at an Anglican ACNA church just north of downtown, and we're really neither of us had come from kind of a high church background, and so we were really enchanted by the beauty of liturgy and this corporate work of confession and prayer and call and response. And so we thought when we'd go, of all places, to the East Coast, we'd find ourselves an Anglican church, maybe an Episcopal church, and be good to go. And instead, after trying, I mean, Princeton Seminary is a PCUSA school. I'm not Presbyterian, but we looked at some PCUSA school churches, some uh, Episcopal churches, and the Anglican churches were a bit too far away to travel to. Um, and then through a series of just distant connections. My wife's college roommate knew someone who was an elder at Jacob's Well, and they were in Connecticut, but they were coming down to visit Jacob's Well and said, you should drive up and check it out too. And so all right, I have a free Sunday. We're trying to find a church. Let me go see what this is. And it's in the small storefront just off Highway 27. And it is a truly evangelical church that was growing. And the pastor, Scott, is a Gordon trained preacher who studied with, I believe, Tim Keller's son or nephew, and was a by the book expository preacher. And my first Sunday there, he was going through, they're closing their series on Revelation. And I thought, this is going to be something. Either it'll be great or it will be terrible. Uh, and Scott was incredible, uh, not only in the humility that he brought to the text and trying to understand it, but in his desire to educate his congregation on different ways that people read a really challenging and ambiguous and at times problematic text. And that piqued my attention enough and my interest enough to want to know more. And so I looked around, but they were in Acts 29 church, which is uh, a strain of like the conservative reform movement of like the Matt Chandlers. I think Mark Driscoll was a part of it at a time, and that just wasn't the scene I wanted to be a part of. Uh, but that assumption kept getting bumped up against the people I was meeting at Jacob's Well, who did not exemplify what I associated with kind of an Acts 29. It's not a denomination, but it's a network of churches, I believe. And then it came time for my field ed and for seminary. And as seminaries go and field ed goes, I did not know until the last minute that I needed to pick something for the following summer much earlier than I thought I would. And so a friend of mine was interning at Jacob's Well. I said, do you think they'd bring me on? I haven't met Scott. I haven't met the staff. I've only been there a couple times. He's like, oh yeah, like let me send Scott a text. And within a couple days, we were up at a diner in Franklin, and I met with Scott, and he said, I'm going on vacation before the paperwork is due, but we'll make this work. So send
Hmm,
it over, I'll sign it, and we'll figure out the details later.
hmm.
And he didn't know who I was apart from this other intern's kind of light recommendation of me. This is my first year of seminary, so I didn't know the intern super well either. Uh, but they brought me on that summer. It was the summer of 2020, and so we were navigating
Oh,
COVID.
goodness. Yeah.
It's a it's a church striving to live in multi-ethnic community that was still predominantly white amid the murder of George Floyd and America's racial reckoning. And I sat in those all-staff meetings as this church faithfully tried to figure out what is our response to all of these things. And it was the challenge of we can't misstep. We need to do this perfectly. We need to roll out things slowly. And other perspectives in the all staff meeting saying, no, we need to do something right now. We can't continue with our series on the Psalms. We need to talk about what's happening in the world, and we might fail, and we might misstep or misspeak, and that's okay because we are doing something. We are responding to these crises that are deeply theological happening in our country, and so I met Jacob as well as they were being forged in the fire of all of these things taking place, and then got to experience the fruits of what came out of that, which looked like a lot of people leaving, but also a lot of people staying and choosing to live through the difficulties of what it would mean to be together, to worship together across our differences as we strive to live in a multi-ethnic community that didn't look kind of like the flippant language of like the multi-ethnic church movement of the early 2000s where it was, get the brown guy on stage or have, the black woman lead worship and do a gospel hymn instead of the typical, elevation worship song. It was, we're going to put black and brown people on our elder board. They're going to preach. They're going to be in the band. They're going to lead our small groups. They're going to be the people who are the foundation of this church, and it's not going to be just Scott and his Gordon degree. And they lived into that vision with many faults, but also with a deep passion that continues to inspire me today when I think of everything happening in and around the evangelical tradition. And I know Jacob's Well is still there, still thriving, still growing, and that for me is always a place of hope and a place of deep grounding to say that people rooted deeply in the evangelical tradition can do this work, and they can do this work so, so well, if only they have the eyes and the willingness to see that. That's a long-winded way to go on about Jacob's Well.
No, that's interesting.
But yeah, it's a
obviously it had a
beautiful
big
place.
impact on you, so I was curious about, what it was like.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's get back to the book a little bit more directly. You use the illustrations of a table, quite a bit in the book. Can you explain, why you chose that approach?
Yeah, as I mentioned, the earlier draft of the book did not have many illustrations. Uh, but going through the editorial process, it seemed like the book kept hovering like a couple inches above the ground, but never touched down. It was always kind of in the realm of musings and theological arguments. And so the book in its initial manuscript was maybe 2, 3 times as long. Now it's a short book, and intentionally so. But we cut a lot of the theological musings, and I had made some different theological arguments in the book. And again, it's thinking of the audience of lay leaders and
Yeah.
pastors and people who want to figure out how to love their neighbors well out of the Christian tradition. We move towards a deeply practical, without, in my best attempt, without being prescriptive, but practical attempt to figure out how we love our neighbors. And that's when a lot of the illustrations were brought in. And immediately the table came to mind as a central one. There's two primary reasons. The first is that in reading the Gospels, I think Jesus is always at tables. Robert Karras has this book called Eating Your Way Through Luke's Gospel, and says something like Jesus is always coming from, at, or going to a meal. And I take that to say Jesus is always coming from, at, or going to a table. He's going to be with other people. And I think while it's right and good to exalt Jesus' divinity, his the fullness of God that is contained within him, the table for me exemplifies and grounds Jesus' humanity. That Jesus is lounging and eating and sitting with other people, that he needs the company of others in the same way that we do to feel human and grounded and loved. Jesus needs nourishment. He needs water to quench, his thirst after hours of preaching to thousands of people. He needs sleep and he needs to get off of his feet after long walks, from traveling from place to place. There's this just deeply humanizing element to the table in Jesus' ministry. And it's also where these deep theologically rich conversations happen and stories are shared and others are taught through the things that happen at the table, whether it's the Last Supper, whether it's the woman who anoints Jesus' feet. There's so much potency of the table in Jesus' ministry. Uh, the other reason I use the table is that it's everywhere. I mean, we're both sitting at tables. Every coffee shop is filled with tables. Libraries are filled with tables. And, I used to take the train to Chicago for work. I put down the table that was attached to the
Yes,
seat behind me, and those become places of commonality. And if the common good is cultivated at the shared table and tables are everywhere, then I think the potential for cultivating a truly common good is also everywhere. And so the abundance of tables, but also their theological significance were two primary reasons why I wanted to move directly
Mm,
towards centering the table as a place where we come together across our differences, to love one another and to cultivate a common good.
very cool. So there's another metaphor that you use in the book about the potluck dinner, and you contrast that with the great melting pot. Can you share that distinction with us?
Yeah, I mean, folks might remember, what is it, the Schoolhouse Rock song, "The Great American Melting Pot."
Hmm.
And I remember watching that in middle school, maybe elementary school, and finding it wholly. The song was great, it was catchy, but the imagery was wholly unappetizing in that it was all of these people jumping into this giant pot and, in a sense, like being melded together into a single thing that's supposed to be American. And I get the positive connotation to that, but also, I was thinking of myself, like if I jumped into a pot with all the people around me, I would essentially just get dissolved into them, which is assimilation, uh, which I didn't at the time have the language in middle school, elementary school to know what assimilation was. Uh, but the imagery didn't make sense to me. Um, when I first got connected with Interfaith America, at the time it was Interfaith Youth Corps, in my later years of undergrad, which Moody was not happy by any means that I was ending up with Interfaith Youth Corps. But Ibu Patel, who founded the organization, uh, was just beginning to draw from folks like Danielle Allen to emphasize this image of the potluck. And Ibu's take on it was that, uh, America is a great potluck, in that we bring our dishes and the best of our traditions, and we come together and we feast together, uh, not trying to throw each of our dishes into this giant vat where they're all mixed together, but that we acknowledge and appreciate and respect the different values and beliefs, the different meals that people bring. Um, there are countless ways to extend this illustration. And to a point you get to where it's like, this doesn't make sense anymore. But I think the way that I've tried to draw deeper into that illustration is to say that when I think of what I bring to the potluck and what other people bring, um, there's a deep intentionality to it that the meals that we bring to share with others often say something about ourselves, about the people and the places that we come from, about the things that we love and enjoy, about the stories of how these meals were created and crafted, perhaps handed down from generation to generation across place and time. Um, and so there's a way in which we taste one another's dishes with deep respect and we taste them anew. Uh, my biryani tastes different when it's accompanied by my wife, grew up in Latvia and, is a fan of her cold soups, and a biryani tastes way different when it's accompanied with a beet soup, let alone someone's empanada, and whatever other things, folks bring, a Caesar salad, a booyah, here in Wisconsin, is, this gigantic gumbo of sorts. And so all of these things eaten together are tasted anew, when they're eaten side by side. And I think another thing with the potluck that is that it centers this deep, attentive hospitality. Um, in that we have to consider who is joining us, how we will make space for them. What will we do with something like a dietary restriction where someone says, I can't be around peanuts, like I will have an allergic reaction. And so you don't just throw together a potluck and say, you know, well, hope everything goes right. You, as the host, say, let's know what people need. I think the same thing goes for accessibility. When we think of, in the in American context, the the church may very well have the biggest space for people to gather. Christians are also very used to playing host, in these kind of contexts, and very rarely get to be, um, or choose to be the guest at someone else's table.
Mm.
And so perhaps the church has the biggest venue for to seat the most people, but maybe the synagogue, is easier to access by public transit, which means that people without cars can get there. Maybe one is located in a high rise that can't be accessed by people with physical disabilities. But someone else's place, or community center is easy and has an on ramp, for folks to get through the doors. And so, again, the illustration can be extended in too many ways. But I think what I'm trying to get at with the potluck over a melting pot is one, getting rid of this idea of assimilation, and that to be together means we have to dissolve all of our particularities into this one homogenous thing. And instead we come in the beauty and the challenges of our particularities, and place them side by side. And the other is that this intentional work of the potluck means coming together, but not without consideration of who is actually showing up and how we care for them, how we keep people safe, how we love them, how we meet the needs that they might have in order to fully participate with everyone else. And so I think there's this deep radical hospitality, that accommodates people, both in their beliefs and the perspectives they bring, but also in the physical ways that they show up so that we can be together.
Well, I really like that distinction. I'm glad that focused on that, in the book. That's not one that I had heard before,
Mm,
between a potluck supper and a melting pot. So thank you for that.
yeah.
There's another chapter in the book where you described a few tangible practices that we should try to use. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, this was a challenging chapter. As I mentioned, uh, the idea of neighbor love seems easy enough. It's all throughout scripture. We put it everywhere. It's on, it's outside your church. It's in, um, books and devotionals, and we're just like, oh yeah, we love our neighbors. That's what we're called to do. And then I look outside my window and I see my neighbor and his yard signs, and I go, how do I love this person? What does that even begin to look like? And I talk about in the book that it's far easier to read about our neighbors in books and surveys and place them in different, data and categories and make assumptions about them based on that. Uh, but the work of neighbor love is messy and complicated, and I don't think there's this single way that we love our neighbors because each of our neighbors are different. And so when it came to describing practices of neighbor love, I didn't want to be prescriptive and saying, this is how you love your neighbor. Go do these things and act in this way and say this thing to them. Um, but on the flip side, I also believe that the scriptures and the witness of the church gives us tangible examples that are tried and true throughout history that, adapted to different contexts, are radical and effective practices of loving our neighbors. And so some of them are very straightforward, and they're ones that you would likely expect to see. I talk about compassion and the parable of the Good Samaritan, and talk about how in that parable, which is we've all heard one too many sermons about, and so I kept things brief, that, three huge takeaways for me are, one, that the Samaritan helps the man who was beaten and robbed, without justifying some sort of inaction because he didn't cause the harm. And I think so often, especially in the US today, we see all of the injustices happening around us, and we say, well, that's not my fault. I didn't create this system. I might be also someone affected by the system. And so who am I to try to love the people who are also affected by it? And I think the Samaritan shows us we do because we're moved by compassion, because that's what Christ calls us to. Uh, Another is that, if people know anything about this parable, it's that the Samaritan and Jewish communities are irreparably at odds. And it would certainly be a practice of neighbor love if Jesus centered the priest or the Levite as the protagonist who helped the Samaritan who was beaten. But by displacing his Jewish community as the protagonist, he Jesus makes his audience think not only if they can love their neighbor, but if they can imagine their neighbor loving or their enemy loving them back. Um, and that is a challenge for us today, especially as there are so many folks who you might consider enemies, incapable of loving us. And the third is that neighbor love is often stranger love. Often we're loving people we haven't met before, people who come across our lives in various ways, who we don't have a prior connection to, and that doesn't excuse us from the work of neighbor love. That's the example that we see time and time again, and it harkens back to the Levitical example of neighbor love, which is the first place we see the commandment in regard to the foreigner or to the alien. And so I talk about practices like compassion and humility. For folks who want to nerd out about Martin Heidegger, I get my little Heideggerian tidbit about thrownness in there, but focus more on the incarnation of Christ as a radical act of humility that's a model for us of how we live. But so I take in some practices that are more well known, but then I also move to try to offer some new language to practices that are likely familiar. And so I talk about resonance, which is a play on Heart Met Rosa, who has a very long book about resonance. He's a sociologist, but talks about how folks either resonate or feel this deep experience of alienation with the world. Rosa talks about resonance in this very wonderful musical illustration of what it means to be in tune with others. I think for the Christian, that looks like how do we join in tune with our neighbors, both in shouts of joy, but also cries of sorrow? How do we resonate in a way that we create a beautiful sound together, a harmonious sound that echoes and reverberates love and compassion and care throughout our neighborhoods? I also draw from Paul Farmer, who, alongside Gustavo Gutierrez, has this language of accompaniment that Farmer applies in his work as a medical practitioner and advocate. He's a co-founder for Partners in Health, which first established in the 1980s a state-of-the-art hospital in Haiti when the medical community said it was impossible to do so or worthless to do so because for deeply racialized reasons and also positions of financial privilege, thought that the people of Haiti were not worth the effort to care for these very preventable ailments and diseases. And Farmer was not satisfied with that, and instead, through his education at Harvard Medical School, flies to Haiti and takes not only his knowledge, but he steals equipment from Harvard Medical School so he can go treat people in Haiti. And when he meets Gutierrez, who asks this question of how do we show God's love to the poor and the oppressed and the pressed down and the downtrodden and the outcast, and he says that we accompany them the way that Christ accompanies them. And Farmer takes this into this radical practice of caring with and for people in a way that they become companions on a journey that he says is not dictated by the healer, but by the one who is being accompanied. When they say that the time has ended for us to be together, then I leave. But I do not leave when I feel like my job as a healer, as a medical practitioner, is done. And so he spends his days not meeting his patients in a hospital, but going out to them and walking miles and miles to these remote villages around Haiti to be with his patients, to share a meal with them, to spend time knowing who they are and what they love and care about. Their concerns not only for the health of the people around them, but for their entire communities and what's needed there. And Pharma replicates this with Partners in Health across the globe and creates state-of-the-art hospitals in places that people deemed impossible to do so, just like Haiti. Uh, and so I say, this is a radical practice of neighbor love. What does it mean to accompany people in our daily lives, to walk with them, to become companions with them through their hardships, not to the point that we deem, all right, I'm done with this, but to the point that the person being accompanied says, all right, I think I'm okay. Um, yeah, and so I try to incorporate some new language that's exemplified by people in ways that are, if we can do an ounce of what Farmer did in his lifetime, I think that will be a life well lived. But I think this practice of accompaniment too is a radical practice of neighbor love that, again, it's not novel, but puts new language and a new story and picture to something that I think people have been doing for a long time.
Wow. Wow. Well, this has been very helpful to hear the reasoning behind, you know, your book and the different parts, of it. So I hope that people will be able to glean that from listening to this interview in addition to reading the book. So,
Absolutely.
I realize, you're right in the midst of launching a new book, but I have to ask you if you have any plans that you can talk about for any future books or other kinds of projects.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I'm in the early stages of a PhD program at U Chicago, and so that's taken up a good amount of my time. I'm also still with Interfaith America, leading the Good Neighbors project, and so we have fun things coming out there and trying to develop resources with through Interfaith America for these evangelical communities. Um, I hope that this is book one of many future projects. My ambition for better or worse says, yeah, I think in this program, if the opportunity came around that another book like this could come through, it also may very well look like the next book is in a good while from now and it's some version of my dissertation. But even in that, uh, I do not feel a deep compulsion to move into the very niche space of the Guild of Religious Scholarship. As I talked about earlier, so much of my work is deeply rooted in people and place and wanting to offer something to the public, to a broader community that is actually useful and meaningful to their daily lives. And often the monograph, it is not the task of the monograph to do that. It is a product of the Guild. It is the work of a dissertation. Um, but I'm really grateful for my advisor, Kevin Hector, who is a deeply accomplished philosopher and theologian, whose latest book is called Christianity as a Way of Life. And it's a systematic theology that's written more like Kevin Hector, who was a public school teacher, than Kevin Hector, who is a renowned theologian teaching at a premier academic institution. It's filled with incredible examples and stories, but it's a systematic theology and it's beautiful and it's accessible. And so I hope that the work that I do after this follows in his footsteps and in the work that he's doing that's bringing together the public and the academy, because I think there's so much benefit that comes from these two spaces coming together and learning from one another and informing one another. And so at this point, no book number two on the horizon, but many
It
ideas
sounds
that
like
I'm
very likely that
tinkering
there
with.
will
And
be.
yeah, and so I certainly hope so. Yeah, and that it's this book and any future ones can be a gift to the people who read them.
Good, good, good for you. Good for you. Well, again, the title of this book, Becoming Neighbors, The Common Good Made Local. Check it out at Amar's website, amarpeterman.com, and Erdman's, of course, erdmans.com. So thanks so much for joining us. Many congratulations on accomplishing a book. I know how big of a task that is, and hope it does really well for you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.